Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Shanila Koja Mulji, and I'm a faculty member at the Al Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding here at Georgetown University. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Katrina Daly Thompson, who will speak about her new book, Muslims on the Margins, Creating Queer Religious Community in North America. The book is a multi-sided ethnography of nonconformist Muslim communities, and it sits at the intersection of queer anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and Islamic studies. Dr. Thompson is a professor in the humanities and of African cultural studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Their research and teaching interests include language, power, and identity, and gender and Islam in the Swahili Coast and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. Professor Thompson will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to engage her in a conversation. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to just briefly give an outline of my talk so you know what to expect. Again, I want to thank Shanila very much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself and how I got interested in this project, and then I'm going to structure the talk around the terms in the title. So what I mean by margins, what I mean by religious community, queer, and creating community, as well as where I did the research in different parts of North America. And then I'll talk briefly about a couple of important terms and themes that run throughout the book but are not in the title. And then I'm going to end by reading a little bit from the coda to the book, and hopefully we'll have quite a bit of time for questions at the end. So you see in this quote here from Michael Muhammad Knight, this is from his book, Tripping with Allah. He wrote, "Beneath or beyond the absolutism, Islam has always been home to misfits, freaks, rebels, and queers." And I had actually hoped to use part of this, everything except for freaks, as the title of the book, Misfits, Rebels, and Queers, but the press overrode that and went with Muslims on the Margins. But I think you'll see why I see a lot of the folks that participated in my research and why they see themselves often as misfits, rebels, and queers within Islam. So a little bit about me. I am a Muslim. I converted to Islam in 2009. I am a linguistic anthropologist, which means my research concerns the relationship between language and culture. And most of my research prior to this project, and again now after this project, has been in East Africa among Swahili-speaking Muslims. But for about 6 years, I wasn't able to go back to East Africa for personal reasons. And so I started this project working in groups in North America. I consider myself a member of the larger community that I'm writing about in this book. Around this time I converted in 2009, I was living in Los Angeles, and I got very involved in a group that had a large chapter there called Muslims for Progressive Values, and was involved in that group for about 4 years until I left LA to move to Madison. And even became part of the leadership of the group, helped host Friday prayers and things like that. And through that group, I got to know a lot of other Muslims throughout North America who were involved in either groups that were affiliated with Muslims for Progressive Values or kind of running in parallel that had similar politics and religious interpretations. So when I started this project in 2016, I was able to use those connections that I had made to folks in these other groups to set up visits to various groups throughout North America, as well as to do research in 3 large online groups that are based on Facebook. So I want to talk about the margins that are in the title of this book. And I'd like to ask for those of you in the audience to write in the chat, either based on your personal experience or research or reading that you've done, what kinds of Muslims do you think are on the margins of Islam? And I'll just read some out loud as they show up there. So women, yes, in some communities. Anyone besides women? African Americans, yes. Members of the queer community, people with disabilities, Shia Muslims in some spaces. Great. So those are the main groups that I was thinking of and expecting to hear from you. But I would also add that other people who can be on the margins in some Muslim communities include those who try to include these folks that we've listed here. So not just LGBTQ folks, for example, but also those who want their communities to be inclusive of LGBTQ folks, that inclusivity can push others to the margins as well. I want to read this quotation from feminist philosopher Bell Hooks. She writes, "For me, the space of radical openness is a margin, a profound edge. Locating oneself there is difficult yet necessary. It is not a safe place. One is always at risk. One needs a community of resistance." So not all of the Muslims that I consider nonconformists that I met or interacted with in online groups were themselves marginalized, but I argue that all of them were on the margins of the global Muslim community. And I'll use my friend Azim as an example. Azim is a cisgender South Asian American man, a Sunni Muslim, and a native speaker of English who lives in Los Angeles. He was not necessarily marginalized in other Muslim communities, but he entered the margins because of his feminism, his views on LGBTQ plus equality, his openness to diverse interpretations and practices. So to be marginalized is to be the object of another's marginalizing actions or discourse, but to enter the margins for someone like Azim could be a choice. The space of the margin, Bell Hooks reminds us in this quotation, is necessary for people who experience oppression. It can be a community of resistance, not only for the oppressed, but also for those who stand alongside them and wish to fight that oppression. So turning to the term queer. When I use queer or queers as a noun in the book, I do so in an identitarian sense to refer to those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, or any of the rapidly proliferating labels used to classify gender and sexual diversity. In this sense, I use the term Muslim queers and LGBTQ plus Muslims interchangeably. But when I use the adjective queer, I refer to nonconformist Muslims more generally, who I argue trouble norms that exclude LGBTQ plus folks and other nonconformists from Islam. Similarly, when I use queer as a verb, I refer to the disruption that queers and other nonconformists enact in relation to wider understandings of Islam. So queer does not necessarily mean LGBTQ, but can also mean anti-normative, nonconformist, heterogeneous, different, and celebrating difference. So we see in this quotation on the slide from my friend Frank, who was a co-founder and co-leader of the Columbus Unity Mosque, which at that time was affiliated with both Muslims for Progressive Values and El Tawhid Juma Circle Unity Mosque in Toronto. And Frank wrote on Facebook, "To be queer is to be faithful to one's true nature. To be queer is to have allowed oneself to be the unique person one is meant to be. Being queer is not about sexuality. It is about integrity." The majority of folks who participated in my research interviews were not LGBTQ themselves, but most of them mentioned LGBTQ inclusivity as part of their interest in nonconformist groups or definitions of what it means to be progressive. They were very diverse in gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, languages spoken, disabilities, sect, and location. So when I talk about this as a religious community, I'm referring to the fact that most other research on LGBTQ Muslims has focused on their individual identities and sometimes in their involvement in support groups, but very little of it has examined their involvement in religious communities, in part because communities that welcome them are rare, and in part because of assumptions that it is impossible to be both Muslim and LGBTQ. However nonconformist some Muslims are, they are Muslims engaged with the Islamic discursive tradition. While some might be considered secular or cultural Muslims, most of those in the book did consider themselves religious, even if they sometimes engaged with Islam in unconventional ways. So I want to share this quotation from Kelly, who was a co-leader of the Atlanta Unity Mosque, which, like the Columbus one I mentioned on the previous slide, was both affiliated with Muslims for Progressive Values and with Al Tawhid Juma Circle in Toronto, has since left dissolved its affiliation with Muslims for Progressive Values, and I'll talk more about that later. But Kelly said, "I have this rational side of me that just is like, I'm never going to be able to prove that God exists. It's not possible for me. So I don't mind living in a space where, I don't know, but I'm still going to participate in a religious community because I can't explain some experiences that I've had. And this is how I connect to that side of myself." So this quote from Kelly came from a conversation after Friday prayers, or actually I think it was kind of during the sermon. And many of the communities that I visited, sometimes instead of having a single person give the sermon, they would have kind of a community conversation. And that's where this kind of quotation came from. But other religious settings where my data came from included Friday prayers themselves, Eid prayers, halakha or study circles, and other religious discussions. So what do I mean by creating community? At the Al Tawhid Juma Circle Unity Mosque in Toronto, where they've been gathering for Friday prayers every Friday since 2009, they have this etiquette sheet that they read aloud from every week. And that has also been shared with some of the other groups that are affiliated with them. Part of this etiquette reads, "Our community is not monolithic, with people from diverse sects and tariqas, with diverse relationships with Islam, and diverse understandings of Islam. Unity Mosque is informed by Sunni, Shia, Sufi, and other Muslim and non-Muslim traditions." This increasingly global community's efforts to include not only women, but also LGBTQ Muslims, Shias, Muslims with disabilities, Black Muslims, and others, offers insights into the successes and challenges of creating a pluralist religious community rooted in social justice. My book reveals the crucial role of online and offline conversation in these processes. I focus on the formation of this community of resistance at multiple scales. Central to my project is the use of discourse, not only in the sense of talk and text, but also as a form of social action. By examining the ways that individual nonconformists talked about their lives and beliefs, and how they used language in conversation and in religious ritual, we gain insight into their lived experiences as Muslims on the margins, what role religious and other texts played in their lives, and the future forms of Muslim collectivity they imagined. At another scale, I examine conversations and embodied interaction within nonconformist groups and mosques, which offers another perspective on lived religion. So the main question that kind of runs throughout the book is, how do nonconformist groups create community? And the methods that I use to address this question include discourse analysis of interviews and recorded interactions. And I do this a little bit differently in each chapter. I'll just kind of quickly offer a very brief overview of each chapter. So one of them looks at how Muslims create community through affective narratives, so how they tell stories together, often during these conversations that take the place of a khutbah or after the Friday prayers. So they're telling one another both how they felt when they found this kind of inclusive community, and how they're developing an inclusive community together and how that feels for them. In another chapter, I look at how they socialize one another into inclusive ways of speaking. So, for example, calling each other out when someone is misgendered, or talking about how the group should be more inclusive of Shia community members. In another chapter, I look at intercorporeality, which is how people use their bodies in relationship to one another's bodies. And I argue that this experience of being together in a religious ritual with people whose bodies are different from oneself kind of opens oneself up to these kinds of more inclusive interpretations, whether that's about hearing a woman give the call to prayer, hearing a woman give the sermon, praying next to someone who is of a different gender than you, or even just entering into a space in the mosque that one wasn't previously allowed to enter into for women, for example. And then in the final chapter, I look at multiple critiques. So how two African-American women who were involved in different communities in the project, despite their kind of commitment to these communities and commitment to being part of nonconformist groups, also critique the ways in which they see these groups not fully living up to their own hopes, both in terms of shared authority and in terms of intersectionality and solidarity with Black folks in particular. And then the final term in the title that I want to talk about is North America. So I collected data in 7 North American cities. Those included Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, DC, Columbus, Ohio, and Toronto, Canada, as well as in 3 online groups that included Muslims for Progressive Values, El Tawhid Juma Circle, and Fitna, which is Feminist Islamic Thinkers of North America. While most of the people that I interviewed and all of the face-to-face groups I examined were in North America, they were also interconnected with one another and with Muslims elsewhere through the internet, and sometimes through offline friendships. Looking at interaction created through online connections and sometimes through travel reveals how nonconformists related with one another across geographic boundaries. By creating a global community, I argue that they spread their unconventional interpretations of Islam beyond North America. So those are the terms in the title, but I want to talk a little bit about a couple of terms and themes that are really important in the book, but are not in the title. I've already used this term nonconformist a few times. And what I mean by this is Muslims on the margins of the Ummah who are trying to create an inclusive community through mosques and other face-to-face groups in North America, as well as through global online groups. The folks in these different groups share identities, interpretations, or practices of Islam that are different from those of more widely understood Muslim communities in various ways. They also share a social justice orientation focused on valuing and incorporating others who exhibit such differences, including queers. The people involved in these groups are contemporary descendants of earlier North American progressive Muslims who were active around the turn of the 21st century and about whom Omid Safi wrote in the book from which this quote appears. But I argue that nonconformists are even further toward the edge of Islam's margins than earlier progressive Muslims were, in large part because their inclusion of LGBTQ Muslims marks them as queer, regardless of their own gender modalities or sexual orientations. Several participants who were involved in earlier progressive Muslim projects shared with me that despite the pioneering efforts of some scholars and activists, those projects fell short of fully including Muslim queers. So the last term I want to talk about is discursive futurism, and I'll start by reading this quote. This is from the Queer Muslim Collective, which is a group of queer Muslims based in India who are now producing this really lovely magazine that both focuses on queerness and Islam as well as on futurism generally, and has a lot of beautiful art in it. They write, "There is no one kind of Islam or just one type of queer Muslim future. There are many kinds of legacies that storytellers will invoke in the future. A futurism that is inclusive is inherently queer. The movement to a queer future that honors stories is inspired by radical fighters, artists, and lovers." Throughout the book, I demonstrate how participants in this global community of Muslim nonconformists, both online and off, were engaged in what I call discursive futurism, using language and joint activity to create new traditions that would create precedents for a more just collective future. Talal Asad, the anthropologist of Islam, wrote, "An Islamic discursive tradition is simply a tradition of Muslim discourse that addresses itself to conceptions of the Islamic past and future, with reference to a particular Islamic practice in the present." So his idea of an Islamic discursive tradition has been really very influential within Islamic studies. But even though he mentions past, present, and future, most scholars who have taken up his work have really dealt primarily with how the Islamic past is taken up in the tradition. And I want to look at how people are using the discursive tradition to create new futures. For many of those in the nonconformist groups I studied, their envisaged Islamic futures were theologically diverse, inclusive of gender and sexual diversity, and often counter to dominant Islamic and other normativities that pushed them to the margins. They did not abandon the Islamic discursive tradition, but their use of it was future-oriented. So finally, before I conclude, I want to read a little bit from the coda to the book. The coda is written in lieu of a more traditional conclusion, as a kind of found poem that uses the words of participants. So because in the core chapters, I do very close analysis of specific conversations and prayers and so on that happened, I was left with a lot of data that I was not able to include, and I didn't want to exclude the voices of many people who had participated in my project. So I decided to go through all the data that hadn't made it into the core analytical parts of the book and create this long poem that's really written in their voices. So you'll hear a lot of different narrators, but I sort of blur them together as if it's one speaker. And it's quite long. I'm only going to read maybe a third of it. We began in a garden. Everybody is born, part of something. I am originally from Egypt, India, Detroit, American born, living in Canada, a proud Australian, born in northern Nigeria, Singapore, Karachi. I'm from Black soil, First Nation. I sit with the Loon clan. I'm from Egypt too. Born and raised in Canada, Syria, Southern Illinois, America, Iraq, Atlanta, by heterosexual parents. I am made of this earth. I rise from it. I will return to it. The garden is within us now. I am a Muslim from the United States, an Arab American, proud Persian and American, Malaysian, Bangladeshi, an American expat based here in Los Angeles. I am a US citizen, a Canadian citizen, now a citizen of this planet. I am a brown woman, a white convert. I am Black, a descendant from stolen people. I am of South Asian, Arab, Saudi descent. I am telling you, in the Middle East, we are different. I feel very comfortable in my own skin. I'll forever be brown. I am a person of color, a woman of color, the minority. I am now an old man. I have been a feminist my whole life. This is what a Muslim feminist looks like today. I am born Jewish from an Irish Catholic family, a Muslim family, a big religious, Muslim family, an African-American Muslim family, a multiracial family. I am the only Muslim in my family of Baptists, Methodists, Catholics, Sikhs. I am a Bengali child of immigrants, a granddaughter of a sheikh, unshackled by any family pressures. I am your next of kin. Dinner with my family is an act of prayer. I have a wonderful family and a nice dog. I am a native Arabic speaker, fluent in Urdu. I speak a little bit of Arabic. some Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, not fluent in any. English was my first language. I took Hebrew for a year. I turned the Arabic duties over to my friend. It's going to be English all the way through. I don't use the Arabic that much these days. It's not like living an Arabic life. It's broken at all levels. Prayer in Arabic is like breathing. It resonates in my body. When I say Bismillah, my aperture opens. I'm not the authority on anything, not trying to stand in your way. I am aware of your religious view. I am here to ask you for tolerance. It's a valid question. I'm listening. I am completely at peace with the way I'm practicing Islam, a journey, right now entirely observant, according to my own interpretation, trying to remember what Allah wants. A person is an authority on their own experience, on their own practice. I am doing something radical. Let us relax into quiet contemplation. I'm an optimistic person, hopeful, looking at the future. I see the need, the interest in the building of solidarity. The Muslim community needs to set aside its differences, accept that we are all in a struggle for liberation together, even if we don't accept each other's theologies, lifestyles, partners, whatever it is. Let us join our voices together, be anti-authority, build coalitions, fight for a collective justice, be part of that movement in solidarity against occupation, colonizations, injustice, alongside Black folks, Filipino folks, trans folks, the indigenous people of this land, all other minorities really, and non-minorities that are part of the white supremacist system that needs to be dismantled. I don't declare myself an LGBT ally. I'm just a human being. I am not afraid of losing my freedom for them. It is imperative. We constantly engage in acts of decolonization, show up in solidarity. I can speak with authority on this. Pride requires extending respect to people who are drastically different from you. Forgive me if I've missed some words here and there. Language is more than just words. I'm still waiting for your answer. There's only the garden we go toward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Thompson, for a wonderful talk. We will now take questions from the audience, but as you know, this lecture is part of my course on American Muslims. And so I have some questions from the students already, so I'll start with those if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the first question is in relation to your choice to use the term nonconformists. And so the student asks, what can you share more about why you chose this term when the participants themselves called themselves inclusivists, pluralists, and universalists? So I think this is a quote from chapter 1 that they read. What other terms did you consider and decided not to use?
Well, the first term that I started the project with was progressive, because I had previously been involved in Muslims for Progressive Values. And I, for a long time, identified myself as a progressive Muslim. But I pretty quickly discovered that a lot of participants in the research no longer liked that term for themselves. You know, even the ones who are still involved in groups where the group itself uses that label. And as I mentioned when I was sort of joking about the quotation from Michael Muhammad Knight, I mean, some folks even use kind of tongue-in-cheek, but terms like rebel, misfit, things like that. And I think, you know, any of these terms could fit, but would perhaps have a negative connotation to some readers. So I was looking for a term that kind of accurately grouped them together to the extent that they do have some shared values, but did not have a negative connotation for them or potentially for readers.
And then as I was looking at it, I was thinking, since gender conforming is part of our common sense and ordinary language. It kind of hints towards that too. So that was helpful.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that, but yeah.
The other question is, what kind of challenges do nonconformists experience to form this community? And what kind of critiques did I think the African American Muslims that you noted in one of the chapters had of these practices?
Yeah, I think the main challenge for most folks who would want to join these kind of communities is that they're few and far between. So many people live in places, you know, if they live outside of a very large city, there might not be a community like this. You know, there can even in Madison, when I first moved here in 2013, I tried to create a community. And I mean, this kind of relates to the terminology question as well, that I couldn't find a term that would attract the kinds of people that I wanted to join. So I had initially started a group that was called Muslim Feminists of Madison, and nobody. And then when I finally started to meet some other Muslims who did identify as feminists in Madison, they said, "Oh, it's because you use that term. No one, you know, that will turn off a lot of people." So I think it is a real struggle to create a community and find a term that describes it, that, you know, is open enough to let people know what to expect when they get there without turning off other people. Another challenge for some groups has been security, that there's some nervousness about, especially for Muslims who are queer or gender nonconforming, that they don't necessarily want to publicize where these groups are meeting, because there might be folks who are homophobic who would harass them or out them to their family members when they're not out yet, or things like that. Though thankfully the folks who brought up that issue said that despite their, or maybe because of their caution, they've never had any problems with harassment, but they still are pretty cautious about that and kind of vetting potential newcomers before they'll tell them where they're meeting. Another challenge has just been finding space where, you know, because many of these groups are not large enough or have the financial ability to establish, you know, a freestanding mosque, that they're either renting or borrowing space from other types of community centers and so on. So that can be a challenge. And then in terms of the critiques that the two African American Muslim women were bringing that I discuss in the final chapter, one had been involved in El Tawhid Juma Circle in Toronto, and her concern was primarily with the way the group promotes themselves as being structured around this model that they call shared authority, in which they theoretically allow any member of the community to take part in a variety of roles. So some of them are decided prior to their Friday meetings, like who will give the sermon or khutbah. People sign up to do those, and anyone in the community can do those. But the folks who are in charge ask to see them in advance and make sure that they kind of fit community norms. And then others are decided during the gathering itself. So once folks have started to gather, when it's almost time, they'll say who would like to lead, who would like to do the call to prayer today, and they'll let anyone do that. But they always ask, or up until a moment that I discuss in the book, they always had women lead the prayer. And during one of the, well, I'll come back to that if there's questions about how that sort of shifted at some point. But basically this participant was talking about that she didn't think they were really following their model of shared authority, that there were kind of restrictions on what kinds of things one could say in a sermon, and whether it had to be vetted, and whether women were allowed to take on all of the same roles of leadership within the mosque structure. And then the other woman had been involved in Muslims for Progressive Values, and she found that she felt like she was being tokenized as a Black Muslim, that she was being asked to take part in kind of MPV advertising campaigns saying what a great experience she had being part of this organization, when in fact, in her opinion, the organization was not doing anything for Black Muslims or other Black people in general. And this was sort of the timing of George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter and so on, that the organization as a whole was not doing enough. And so she brought a lot of critiques about how, she had tried to bring this to the attention of the organization, and they just did not respond effectively. And even though she herself identifies as a lesbian, she felt like the group was overly focused on queer issues as a way to kind of appeal to progressive white Americans to say, sort of, we're the good Muslims. And that being fully in solidarity with Black Americans would have pushed the group outside the bounds of that sort of white progressive politics that they are trying, or in her view, that they're trying to appeal to.
Thank you. And thank you for that detailed answer, because I think it's interesting to see how certain groups on the margins then produce their own normativities. And I think that's something you speak about in the book as well, and how the idea is to expand the margins so that the possibilities are proliferated. And so this was really helpful. There's another question around how, if there is a difference in the treatment by the broader community of those who are marginalized and those who choose to enter the margins. This is from Anna.
Yeah, I think there is. I don't know that I have specific data about this from my project, but just from my own experience and talking with friends and some of the participants in the book, I would say, if you take the example of Azim, the man I mentioned, who I argued, chooses to enter the margins through his affiliation with these groups, that he can go through most of his life without being marginalized. He could go to a mainstream mosque and be fully accepted, pray in the front row, and things like that. So he has to choose, every time he decides whether to, out himself as a feminist, or to say, I'm not going to attend a mosque that has gender segregation, or things like that. So it's kind of maybe like parallel to being in the closet for queer folks, that or just a matter of larger privilege, that some folks have the privilege to be able to choose to move in and out of the margins, whereas others, are constantly marginalized.
There are a couple of questions that are a little bit personal in nature, so I will just ask, and then you can choose to skip over if you don't want to respond. So first is, why did you choose to convert to Islam? And then related to that, Alex asks, what was it like converting to Islam knowing your gender identity would be marginalized? And I'll read another one so that you can see if you want to answer that. And then Carly asks, since Muslims on the margins encompasses several groups with identities that may not overlap, how have these interactions between different groups shaped the form of these communities, the formation of these communities?
Yeah. That one's in the chat right now. I want to read that too.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'll start with that one. I mean, as I mentioned, these groups are very diverse in a lot of different ways. And I think one thing that I observed and really admired in these groups is how most of them are very open to discussing these differences that they have with one another. So, they'll have conversations about race, obviously not in every group. I mean, as the woman Trina, whose interview I discussed in the final project, she did meet with resistance to talking about race in some contexts, but in others, like the Atlanta mosque that she was actually involved in, it seemed to me that other leaders in that group who were of other races She leads the group together with Kelly, who's a white woman that I quoted, and another woman of South Asian background. And they, all three of them, as well as I think other members of the group, are very open to discussing issues of race and racism and how they can be in solidarity with one another. There's a lot of discussion about gender, women's rights, women's experiences, outside of these groups that led them to join, gender nonconformity and being trans, those kinds of issues. Particularly, I think each group that I visited has a slightly different flavor in that respect, depending on the particular constituents in that geographic area. So for example, Atlanta has a larger number of Black participants than some of the other communities I visited. Toronto has a larger number of Muslims of immigrant background, mainly from South Asia. Whereas LA was a greater mix of like converts, as well as immigrants and like second generation folks of children of immigrants and so on. So I think the way they really handle these differences is by being very open about them, but also seeing themselves as an ummah, like that they have this, not only Islam itself in common, but also this particular progressive or nonconformist approach to Islam in common that kind of helps them bridge these differences, as well as to be open to various other forms of inclusivity, kind of constantly pushing one another to, if we're inclusive on this issue, we need to be more inclusive on this other issue, like including people with disabilities or whatever it is. So there's kind of this constant movement toward greater inclusivity.
Thank you. There's another question here from Ahmed. The coda was beautiful, a spoken word. Thank you for this conversation. One challenge I often experience is the mutual understanding of language in this dialogue of supporting those on the margins. You mentioned many terms, even some evolution of terms is proposed that is progressive to nonconformist. Thoughts on what learnings have emerged in building and inviting space to have dialogue on building this shared language, which could help towards striving towards an inclusive community, the space where we can engage a dialogue, not from a defensive posture, but a welcoming one.
Yeah. I think El Tawheed is a really great example of a group that's been very successful in doing this. And one example I discuss, I think in the introduction, but very early in the book, where in their online group, they took this verse from the Quran that they often read during Friday prayers that mentions shaitan. And they had this very long dialogue that went on for years, actually, about whether to use the term shaitan or to translate it in some other way that they felt was more inclusive to the community. And so it was kind of this community tafsir where they were proposing different ways of translating this for the English version, and explaining, why they were proposing a particular translation. And in the end, kind of came up with this consensus together for a particular English translation that they would use that also included some options. So it had one translation, and then in parentheses gave readers a couple of other options that they could use if they wanted to. So again, I would say it's about openness to constantly being willing to revisit the particular terms that a group is using. In that case, it wasn't necessarily the label for the group itself, but just words that they're using within the group. And I think a major difference between these groups and my own experience in some more mainstream groups is this inclusion of dialogue within the religious space itself. So rather than just going to Friday prayers and sitting and listening to a sermon and then saying hello to your friends and leaving, the sermon itself will sometimes involve discussion, as I mentioned, And then in a lot of groups after the prayer, they return to sitting together and actually discuss what the Khatib talked about. And so there's a lot more room for questioning what others say and, explaining your opinions and justifying them and so on than there is in a more traditional Muslim space. And so that can lead to this kind of evolution of thinking and evolution of terminology as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's, and so when you spoke about the shared authority, I think that kind of speaks to that, right? So there's an active, sort of very intentional space that's created for these conversations. Yeah, so that was very beautiful. Thank you. I will see if there are any other questions. Oh, and you have, of course, you have lots of praise in the comments, left the tafsir, the community tafsir. If there are any last minute questions, I'll just check. Otherwise,
I can just give another example of that.
okay, yes, that would be awesome.
That I alluded to earlier. So I mentioned that at El Tawhid, for a long time, they always wanted a woman to lead prayer. And there was one case that I was lucky enough to be there for and record when someone who was perceived as a woman was asked to lead prayer. And this person was Shia. And so the person in charge who asked them to lead said, you're the only Shia woman here, and we like to, have some variety with Shia occasionally leading prayer. And this woman, I call her Salma in the book, or this person, I should say, spoke up and said, "Oh, I'm not a woman, so you shouldn't have me lead the prayer if you're looking for a Shia woman." And the coordinating imam said, "Oh, he was really surprised because this person had always presented as a woman and, dressed in a sort of feminine style and so on." And he said, "Well, then what should we call you?" And Selma said, "I'm gender nonconforming. So this would not be a woman-led prayer, but it would also not be a male-led prayer." And so then other folks who were participating started suggesting terms. Well, why don't we call it a non-male led prayer? Or I don't even remember exactly, but they basically started pitching in all these different ideas, and then in the end came up with something that was like that, like we'll call it a non-male led prayer or something like that. And so even though their norm up till that point had been women-led prayer, they were able to shift both their terminology and their inclusivity in order to include more folks in the process of labeling what they were doing, as well as in the process of the religious ritual itself.
And that kind of shows how the tradition isn't stagnant. It's like kind of moves fast. It's very fluid, right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Thompson, for a beautiful talk and for enlightening us. I'm sure my students had learned a lot, and I see a lot of other public audience as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and hopefully we'll see you at the next ACMCU event. Thank you, Professor Thompson.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
You too. Bye.